Before we begin this story, subscribe to the channel, because here every mansion holds a secret, and every silence hides something that should never have been discovered. Turn on notifications so you don't miss the next mysteries. You never know what truth will be revealed in the next video. And tell me in the comments, what city and country are you watching from? I want to know how far these stories are going. The Hawthorne Mansion sat atop a secluded hill, surrounded by ancient oak trees whose roots warped the soil like fingers trying to escape the earth. Built in 1891 on the outskirts of a small town in Massachusetts, the house was officially a historic landmark. Unofficially, it was avoided. No sign indicated this, but the silence surrounding it spoke volumes. Ethan Caldwell arrived in town on a grey October morning, driving a rental car that stood out from the old vans parked along the main street. A historian specializing in the restoration of historic buildings, he had been hired by a private foundation to assess the Hawthorne Mansion before its opening to the public. The job, in theory, was simple: structural inspection, analysis of old documents, and a technical report. Yet from the first email he received, there was something unsettling about the way the project was described. Gaps, omitted dates, erased names. Ethan didn't believe in omens. He believed in files, blueprints, and concrete evidence. On the other side of the equation was Margaret Bell, representative of the Hawthorne Trust Foundation. She was born in the town, knew every street and every rumor, but spoke of the mansion with an almost mechanical coldness. She never smiled when mentioning it. She never went into details. She only repeated that it was essential to preserve history as it really was. The conflict wasn't explicitly stated. It insinuated itself in the details, in the heavy key given to Ethan, too old for a renovated house, in the contract that prohibited him from accessing the basement without express authorization, in the clause that exempted the foundation from liability for unforeseen events of a psychological nature. As he crossed the iron gates, Ethan realized that the mansion seemed larger inside than the original blueprints indicated. Corridors that were too long, doors that weren't on the drawings. The air carried a metallic odor, like rust mixed with damp wood. He began the work methodically. He photographed cracks, noted leaks, compared measurements. Everything seemed normal, until it didn't anymore. On the second floor, an entire room was missing from the official blueprints. It wasn't a later renovation error. The architecture was original. The interior walls bore marks of something that had been forcibly scraped away. Symbols, words. Ethan couldn't identify them, just jagged grooves, as if someone had desperately tried to erase something. That night, staying at the only motel in town, he decided to consult the public archives. Old newspapers, death records, municipal minutes. The mansion appeared frequently. Balls, charity events, illustrious visits. But between 1912 and 1924, there was an absolute void. No mention, no photographs, no events. People, however, had died during that period. Many. But the addresses were never specified. On the third day, Ethan returned to the mansion earlier than planned. The fog still covered the grounds, and the house seemed to watch him, motionless and patient. Upon entering, he noticed something subtly different. A door in the east hallway was ajar. He was certain he had left it closed. Behind her, a narrow staircase descended to a level not mentioned in any document. It wasn't the main cellar, it was something older, deeper. The air down there was heavy, difficult to breathe. The walls were of rough stone, and the floor bore repeated drag marks, as if something heavy had been moved countless times. Ethan didn't go all the way down. Something inside him, not fear, but instinct, made him hold back. When he returned to the ground floor, he found Margaret Bell standing in the lobby, watching him silently. She didn't ask what he had seen. She simply said, in a low, controlled voice, "Some parts of history were not meant to survive." At that moment, Ethan understood that he wasn't there merely to restore a mansion. He was there to touch something that had been deliberately buried, not by time, but by human choice. And whatever had been erased from that house still remained there, waiting. The town of Ashford seemed to exist outside of time. The shopfronts bore old signs, preserved more out of neglect than historical zeal. People greeted Ethan with restrained politeness, but avoided prolonged conversations. There was no hostility, only a silent caution, as if any poorly chosen word could reopen something everyone preferred to keep closed. Daily life followed a predictable rhythm. The church bell marked the hours, the corner cafe always opened at 6, and by 8 o'clock at night the streets were almost empty. Still, Ethan began to notice small disruptions to this pattern. Averted glances when he mentioned the mansion, voices that automatically lowered in tone, long pauses before simple answers. Margaret Bell was a constant, though rarely intrusive, presence. She would arrive at the mansion at irregular hours, always impeccably dressed, carrying old briefcases and avoiding physical contact with any object in the house. She never sat down. She never took off her coat. She watched Ethan work like someone overseeing a procedure too delicate to be interrupted. As the days passed, Ethan noticed subtle contradictions in his words. Sometimes he referred to the mansion as if he had lived there. At other times, he spoke of it as a place he had never dared to traverse completely. His knowledge was profound but selective. Precise dates came easily, except when the subject approached the time span that Ethan had already identified as problematic. The mansion's interior began to reveal itself in layers. Each room seemed to have a function beyond aesthetics. The main hall, for example, had strange acoustics. Sounds echoed irregularly, as if the space were larger than it appeared. In the former owner's office, the fireplace had been sealed with bricks that didn't match the rest of the structure, a modification too crude for a high-end home. The town's secondary characters also began to take shape. Thomas Reed, the local librarian, was a thin, slow-spoken man who knew the archives better than any digital catalogue. He helped Ethan, but always with clear limits. Certain documents were simply unavailable. Others had pages torn out decades earlier, leaving yellowed edges and broken numbering. There was also Helen Moore, the cafe owner, whose family had been in town for generations. She never spontaneously mentioned the mansion, but she watched Ethan with excessive attention whenever he entered the dust-covered old establishment. On one of those occasions, she let slip a short, almost involuntary phrase, "That house doesn't like change." She didn't explain. She didn't need to. Culturally, Ashford was marked by a quiet pride in its colonial heritage. Local festivals celebrated founders, religious dates, and rigorously preserved traditions. Curiously, no event made direct reference to the Hawthorne Mansion, despite its obvious historical importance. It existed as a collective blind spot, visible but never integrated into the city's public identity. Inside the mansion, Ethan began to find objects that were not listed in the official inventories. Chairs reinforced with hidden iron, internal locks installed inside the rooms, small circular openings in the walls, always positioned at chest height. Nothing was explicitly explained. Everything suggested repeated, planned, systematic use. The antagonism didn't manifest itself in direct confrontation. It solidified in Margaret's passive resistance, in the residents' reluctance, in the architecture that seemed to hide more than it protected. The mansion didn't react in a supernatural way. It reacted as a space molded to control behavior. Ethan, for his part, was beginning to change. His method remained rational, but his attention had become obsessive. He stopped noting technical details and started observing patterns. He walked around the house at night, trying to understand how certain sounds always appeared at the same times. His involvement ceased to be professional and became personal. By the end of that week, he understood something essential. Whatever had happened there was not the work of an isolated individual. It had involved the house, the city, and people who had learned to survive by pretending that nothing had happened. And silence, more than the mansion, was the true guardian of that secret. The first real obstacle arose administratively, almost mundanely. Ethan received an email from the Hawthorne Trust requesting that he submit partial reports before the agreed deadline. It wasn't an unusual request, but the tone of the message carried excessive urgency. The attachment included a standardized template that omitted important fields, especially any mention of uncatalogued areas. Ethan ignored the model. In the mansion, the atmosphere began to respond differently to his presence. Doors that had previously creaked began to open silently. The clock in the main hallway, which had been stopped for decades, according to the records, began to run intermittently, always running exactly 7 minutes late. It wasn't an inexplicable phenomenon, but it was too specific to be a coincidence. The conflict intensified when he decided to map the lower levels of the house on his own. He didn't enter through the access he had found before. He used an opening behind the sealed fireplace of the old office. The space beyond was not an ordinary basement, but a sequence of narrow chambers linked by low corridors, designed to limit movement and view. There, the mansion revealed a functional logic that did not appear anywhere else. Each room featured subtle variations: chains embedded in the wall, drains in the floor, hooks positioned at different heights. Nothing was rusty. Nothing seemed improvised. This hadn't been done hastily. It had been perfected over time. The new conflict was no longer just about discovering what had happened there, but how long. Meanwhile, the secondary characters began to interfere more directly. Thomas Reed started avoiding Ethan completely. When approached in the library, he pretended not to recognize him. Helen Moore closed the cafe early on specific days, whenever Ethan spent long hours at the mansion. The pattern repeated itself. The further he advanced, the further the town retreated. Margaret Bell, for her part, changed strategy. Instead of silence, she began to offer vague explanations. She said the house had been used as a private institution for some years, without detailing the nature of that institution. She claimed that many records had been destroyed in a fire, although Ethan knew there were no structural traces of fire in that part of the house. The antagonism took clear form when Ethan found a set of record books hidden behind a false wall. They weren't diaries, they were lists, names, dates, clinical observations written with cold precision. Some names were crossed out, others had symbols next to them, circles, dashes, repeated marks indicating progression. Before he could photograph everything, he heard footsteps above him. Margaret didn't go down the stairs. She stood at the top, casting a long shadow down the hallway. For the first time, her control faltered slightly. "You're overstepping the mark," he said, without raising his voice. Ethan responded with action, not words. He put away the books, closed the passage, and left the mansion at that moment, taking with him proof that the conflict was now irreversible. From that day on, more concrete obstacles arose. Access to the mansion became restricted to specific times. Cameras were discreetly installed. The contract was unilaterally revised. The pressure wasn't overt. It was bureaucratic, suffocating, calculated. But the biggest conflict came from within. Ethan began to notice changes in his own perception. He dreamed of corridors he didn't remember seeing while awake. He would wake up with faint marks on his wrists, as if he had gripped something too tightly in his sleep. His focus had become narrow, almost compulsive. He was no longer just investigating the mansion. I was reacting to her. The conflict escalated when Ethan cross-referenced the names in the records with the city's death registry. Many of the missing had living descendants in Ashford. Ordinary people, respected people. Some held public office. Whatever had been done in those chambers did not end in the past. It had continued, silently, through the generations. And now, by bringing this to light, Ethan was not only facing a foundation or an old house, He was facing an entire system built to never be questioned. The subplots began to form almost imperceptibly, intertwined with the progress of Ethan's investigation, like threads that only revealed their function when stretched. The first of these emerged outside the mansion, in the relationships he had believed to be merely functional. Helen Moore began leaving small, unintentional clues. Tickets left on the cafe counter, always with old dates scribbled in the corner. On one of them, Ethan recognized a surname identical to one of the names crossed out in the records found in the mansion. When he tried to question her, Helen looked away and said only that some families learn not to ask questions too early. This subplot revealed an uncomfortable truth. Ashford's silence was not uniform. Some knew partially, some suspected, and some profited from it, not financially but socially. Certain families had risen to prominence precisely during the years when the mansion's records disappeared. Another layer emerged with Thomas Reed. He reappeared one rainy night, knocking on the door of Ethan's motel. He didn't go in. He spoke of the outside hallway, as if crossing the threshold were dangerous. He confessed that his grandfather had been an employee of the mansion, responsible for night maintenance. He said that the men in that position never stayed more than 2 years. Some went mad, others simply left town. Thomas brought something more valuable than documents: context. According to oral accounts from his family, the mansion had functioned not only as a closed institution, but as an experimental site. People were taken there under medical, religious, or judicial justifications. What happened afterward varied, and not everyone died. The most disturbing subplot, however, involved Margaret Bell. Ethan discovered, through genealogical records, that she was not merely a representative of the foundation. She was a direct descendant of the mansion's first owner. Her connection was not professional, it was hereditary. The Hawthorne Trust had been created not to preserve the house, but to control what could be revealed about it. This revelation redefined the antagonism. Margaret wasn't defending the mansion out of convenience. She was defending it out of historical, almost ritualistic obligation. Her rigid behavior, her constant presence, her refusal to enter certain rooms, it all made sense now. Inside the mansion, new complexities arose within the physical space itself. Ethan identified temporal patterns. Certain noises always occurred on the same days of the month. Some rooms seemed to activate only at specific times, when the air pressure changed or when the external silence was absolute. There was nothing supernatural about it, just ancient engineering, designed for total isolation. Time pressure began to mount. The foundation publicly announced the date the mansion would open to the public. Only a few weeks remained. Once open, any in-depth investigation would become impossible. The evidence would be diluted by guided tours and carefully edited official narratives. The subplots converged on a common point. No one there was completely innocent, but few were truly guilty. The city had survived by creating a normality built on omissions. The mansion had been the instrument, not the mind. Ethan realized that if he went ahead, he couldn't simply expose everything. He would have to choose what to reveal to whom and with what consequences. Some truths would destroy entire families, others would keep the cycle intact. The complexity of the conflict no longer lay in discovering the past, but in deciding whether the past should, in fact, be liberated. And time, now officially counted, was not on his side. The turning point didn't happen in the mansion, but in a place Ethan considered too safe to keep secrets: the county court archives. He wasn't looking for more proof of what had happened inside the house. He was looking to understand, because that was allowed. Among partially digitized old files, he found a pattern that had previously gone unnoticed. Several court cases, filed as transfer of custody or internment due to moral incapacity, ended abruptly a few days after the judge's decision. There were no final reports, there were no release orders, just the dry closure of the case. The crucial detail was in the signatures. The same surname appeared repeatedly among judges, medical examiners, and city council members over decades. It wasn't an informal scheme. It was a continuous legal structure adapted to the laws of each era, but always with the same final destination: Hawthorne Manor. The biggest shock came when Ethan cross-referenced these signatures with the records he had removed from the false wall. A specific symbol, a circle crossed by 3 lines, appeared both in the mansion's books and in the court documents. That wasn't an internal marking. It was a seal of approval. The revelation dismantled Ethan's last psychological defense, the idea that it had all been a historical deviation, a mistake of the past. It hadn't. It had been a functional mechanism, legitimized by authorities, sustained by collective silence. That night, he returned to the mansion determined to document everything, not for the foundation, for the outside. But something changed, even before he came in. The newly installed cameras were switched off. Not broken, methodically switched off. The side door, always locked, was open, and the hallway clock showed the correct time for the first time. Upon descending again to the lower chambers, Ethan found something that wasn't in the records. A central, circular room, unlike any of the others. There were no chains or hooks, only deep marks on the floor, forming concentric grooves, as if people had been forced to walk in circles repeatedly. In the center of the room, a wooden structure darkened by time supported metal plates engraved with names. Many of the names were scratched out, others were not. Among them, a recent name, Ethan Caldwell. The revelation wasn't met with immediate panic. It was followed by a cold, devastating realization. He hadn't been hired to investigate. Selected, his specialization, his professional background, his lack of close family ties. Everything made him ideal. Too rational an observer to back down early, too isolated to be sought out later. The antagonism ceased to be abstract at that moment. Margaret Bell appeared in the doorway of the circular room. There was no threat in her posture, only weariness. She didn't deny anything. He said the mansion had never functioned without a final observer, someone from the outside, trained to understand, record, and, when necessary, decide what should be erased again. Some refused. Others went mad. View accepted the role. The house doesn't choose just anyone, she said. It chooses those who are capable of understanding without destroying everything. The turning point was complete. Ethan was no longer the outside investigator. He was part of the machine. The story no longer needed to be uncovered. It needed to be continued or interrupted once and for all. And any choice made now would have an irreversible cost. The first consequence wasn't physical, but structural. The morning after the revelation, Ethan realized his access to the city had changed. His cell phone signal worked, but calls were slow to connect. Emails were sent, but replies never arrived. There was no explicit block, just a constant delay, enough to prevent any immediate action. Inside the mansion, Margaret Bell began to treat him differently. No longer as a hired hand, nor as an intruder. There was a new, almost ceremonial formality. She handed him an additional set of keys, explaining precisely which doors could be opened and which should remain sealed. There were no threats. There was expectation. Ethan initially reacted with silent refusal. He continued documenting everything, but now with the awareness that every step was being observed, not just by people, but by an entire system that was reorganizing itself around him. The mansion seemed more active. Old mechanisms were activated, previously hidden passages became accessible, as if the space were responding to the gradual acceptance of its new role. The town's reaction was equally subtle. Thomas Reed disappeared from the library for days. When he returned, he was more reserved, avoiding any mention of the past. Helen Moore began to treat him with an almost protective kindness, offering him meals free of charge, but ending conversations before they deepened. It was as if everyone knew that Ethan had crossed an invisible line. The internal consequences were harder to ignore. Ethan began to notice lapses in time. Hours he couldn't explain, notes in his own notebook, written in his own handwriting, but with no memory of when he made them. They weren't incoherent, they were too precise, technical, cold assessments of people, spaces, risks. He reacted by trying to anchor himself in routines, fixed schedules, duplicate reports, voice recordings. But even that began to fail. In some recordings, his voice sounded distant, devoid of emotion, describing procedures he swore he had never considered. The biggest consequence, however, was moral. Ethan understood that the mansion no longer needed to force him. It only needed to offer logic. The idea that certain truths, if fully revealed, would cause irreparable damage was beginning to make sense. Not as absolute justification, but as calculation. He began to weigh consequences with increasing coldness, just as the old records did. Margaret didn't pressure her, she just observed. She knew that the real decision wouldn't come from confrontation, but from assimilation. The conflict now manifested itself in small choices: what to officially record, what to keep in private files, what to erase. Each decision generated a chain reaction, a rumor that didn't spread, a document that remained lost, a family that continued intact. The consequences of the tipping point weren't explosive, they were corrosive. Slowly, Ethan went from being someone who reacted to the system to becoming someone who kept it running. And the mansion, silent as always, seemed satisfied not because it had won, but because it had been understood. Overcoming his challenges didn't begin with a grand gesture, but with a subtle disruption to the routine Ethan had been building to survive. He realized he was adapting too quickly. Not to the mansion, but to the logic it imposed. This recognition was the first real act of resistance. Instead of rejecting the role that was offered to him, Ethan decided, occupy it consciously, without allowing him to occupy it completely. If the mansion needed a final observer, then that observer could also become one critical filter, not just a silent enforcer. He began to review the old records with a fresh perspective. Where before he saw lists and procedures, he started to identify patterns of failure, people who survived longer than expected, interrupted entries, symbols corrected hastily. The system had never been perfect, just persistent. The new challenge arose when Ethan realized that the Foundation planned to reactivate part of the structure under a modern pretext, transforming the mansion into a center for immersive historical experiences. The language was neutral, but the intention was clear. To repackage the past, make it acceptable, dilute it into tourist curiosity, it was something he couldn't allow, not in the way it was being handled. Instead of direct confrontation, Ethan initiated almost invisible changes. He adjusted visitation routes to keep critical areas inaccessible without raising suspicion. He reclassified sensitive documents as structurally unstable, postponing analysis. He introduced small administrative delays that, added together, pushed dangerous decisions beyond public deadlines. These actions were not heroic, they were functional. But, for the first time, they served a purpose that wasn't that of the mansion. Ethan's growth became visible in his behavior. He began to leave the house more, to expose himself to the city again, to observe people not as data, but as living consequences of the system. Brief conversations with Helen, glances exchanged with Thomas, shared silences. All of this reinforced what was at stake. Margaret noticed the change. She didn't confront him immediately. She merely commented one night that he was creating unnecessary friction. Ethan responded with an impeccable, irrefutable technical report that justified every decision made. There was no room for dispute. He had learned to use the system's own rules against it. The real growth occurred when Ethan decided to document not only what had happened, but as that had been allowed. He created a parallel archive, not for immediate disclosure, but for future preservation. A record that explained the mechanisms of omission, the legal loopholes, the silent agreements. It wasn't an accusation, it was a map. In doing so, Ethan overcame the greatest internal obstacle, the temptation to erase everything or to reveal everything. He chose a third path, to keep the truth alive without allowing it to be exploited again. The mansion offered no resistance. There were no locked doors, no warnings, just silence. A different kind of silence, denser, as if something had been displaced from its center. Ethan was no longer the man who had arrived in the city seeking a technical report, nor was he the passive guardian that the system had tried to mold him into. He had grown to become something more dangerous to that structure than a rebel, someone who deeply understood how the mechanism worked and knew exactly where it could break down. The build-up to the climax began when Ethan received official confirmation of the mansion's opening date. The event would be large and public, attended by the regional press, state officials, and university representatives. A carefully planned celebration to solidify a definitive narrative before any other could emerge. Time, now, had ceased to be abstract. Ethan focused on wrapping up subplots with surgical precision. The parallel archive he had created was divided into parts, each with a different level of access and comprehension. No single document was enough to destroy the system, but together they formed a chain of events impossible to ignore, if anyone knew how to piece them together. He didn't entrust everything to a single person. Small fragments were delivered to distinct contacts outside of Ashford, a fellow historian known for academic rigor, a journalist specializing in old court cases, a professor of institutional ethics. None of them received the complete picture. Not yet. Inside the mansion, Ethan made final adjustments to the official tour. Key rooms were kept technically accessible, but excluded from the public tour, not due to an explicit prohibition, but due to an architectural logic that was difficult to question. The house continued to conceal its own nerve centers, now with the conscious help of someone who knew its internal layouts. Margaret Bell began appearing more frequently. Her demeanor alternated between vigilance and something bordering on urgency. She spoke of the opening as a point of no return. Once open to the public, the mansion would cease to be a space controlled solely by the Foundation. This made her vulnerable. This vulnerability was exactly what Ethan intended to exploit. Tension grew, not in explosions, but in build-up. Small administrative errors began to surface in the Foundation's documents. Divergent dates, incompatible signatures, nothing immediately illegal, but enough to catch the eye of keen observers. Each inconsistency was deliberate, carefully positioned to appear as human carelessness, not sabotage. The final adjustment came in a silent early morning. Ethan entered the underground circular room alone, not to record nor to erase, just to discreetly alter the arrangement of the metal plates. Some names were repositioned, others had their symbols removed. He didn't change the past, he changed it, a possible interpretation of it. As she left, she found Margaret in the upper hallway. For the first time, she didn't try to hide her tension. "You're forcing the house to choose," he said. Ethan replied without raising his voice. She always chose. She just never had a choice. The preparation for the climax was complete. All the pieces were in place, the official narrative about to be sealed, the system exposed to internal fissures, and Ethan positioned not as a hero or villain, but as a catalyst. All that remained was the moment when all of this would cease to be controllable. And when that happened, there would be no returning to the comfortable silence that had sustained the mansion for over a century. The climax didn't begin with applause, but with silence. On the morning of the inauguration, the Hawthorne mansion was immaculate. Gardens manicured, facades restored, discreet flags indicating the historical character of the place. Journalists positioned themselves before the gates, cameras at the ready, while representatives of the Foundation greeted guests with practiced smiles. Ethan moved among them with calculated ease. His official role was technical, almost invisible. Even so, every step he took inside the house followed a precise plan, built up over weeks. The first rupture occurred during the initial guided tour. While leading the group through the second floor, one of the newly installed sensors malfunctioned, exactly as Ethan had predicted. The malfunction forced the interruption of the standard route and the opening of a temporary alternative route. This route led to an old corridor, not listed in the promotional materials, but perfectly accessible. There, a visiting historian asked the wrong question at the right time. Why isn't this space listed in public records? The prepared answer was never delivered. The journalist accompanying the group recognized symbols on the partially restored walls. Not mystical symbols, but administrative markings identical to those that appeared in old court cases. He mentioned this aloud. One camera captured it, another repeated it. Control began to crumble. Margaret Bell tried to intervene, but the delay was fatal. Curiosity spread quickly. Visitors began to take pictures, compare details, question dates. Nothing there was, in isolation, incriminating. But everything, together, was incompatible with the official narrative. The real climax occurred when Ethan led a small group, unannounced, into the underground circular room. He didn't give any speeches. He simply activated the full illumination of the space, something that had never been done publicly before. The metal plates reflected the light with brutal clarity. Names, dates, legal symbols, an entire system exposed without a single word. A retired judge recognized the seal. A university professor recognized the institutional standard. A journalist understood its scope in seconds. The final twist came when Margaret, in front of everyone, confirmed what she had tried to hide for decades. Not out of guilt, but due to exhaustion, she admitted that the mansion was not a historical deviation, but an accepted solution in its time, a space where society deposited everything it didn't know how to, or didn't want to, deal with. Troublesome people, ambiguous cases, lives that didn't fit together. Ethan didn't confront her. He simply presented the final element, the records showing how this model had been replicated, adapted and legitimized, even after the establishment officially ceased operations. The climax didn't end in shouting or immediate arrests. It ended in something even more devastating, the impossibility of denying. The official narrative crumbled in the face of witnesses too qualified to be silenced. The system had finally lost its main shield, the appearance of normalcy. And Ethan, at the center of it all, demonstrated his final transformation, no longer the neutral technician nor the silent guardian, but the agent he had chosen when Anders, the mechanism, would be exposed. The central conflict had been resolved. But the price of that resolution was yet to be paid. The consequences didn't arrive with sirens, but with official letters, summonses, and formal announcements that piled up in the days following the inauguration. Hawthorne Manor was closed to the public indefinitely under the pretext of structural reassessment. In practice, it was something deeper, a moral reassessment that no authority was prepared to conduct publicly. Investigations were opened at different levels. None of them used overly strong language. There was talk of historical responsibility, obsolete institutional practices, and oversight failures. Even so, names began to circulate outside the reports. Influential families began to protect themselves. Archives that were previously inaccessible suddenly became available for consultation. Ethan remained in Ashford throughout this process. Not as a defendant, nor as a hero, but as an unavoidable technical expert. He was called upon to explain documents, contextualize records, and clarify procedures. Always with precision, always without exaggeration. His demeanor made it impossible to dismiss him as an alarmist. Margaret Bell officially distanced herself from the Foundation. Her testimony, given behind closed doors, became key to understanding the extent of the system. She did not attempt to absolve herself. She simply described coldly how she had learned early on that preserving the home meant preserving the social equilibrium of the city, even if that equilibrium was built upon silent exclusions. The city reacted unevenly. Some residents felt relief, others shame. Many preferred exhaustion to indignation. The past, once exposed, offered no simple solutions, only belated choices. Ethan refused offers to turn his experience into an immediate book or documentary. He knew that sensationalizing it would reduce everything to an overly comfortable narrative. Instead, he handed over his parallel archive to an independent commission on the condition that it be analyzed slowly, rigorously, and without rushing to definitive conclusions. The mansion, empty once more, had lost some of its grandeur. Without visitors, without constant surveillance, it had become merely an old building laden with meaning, no longer an active mechanism. The conclusion did not offer complete redemption. Many victims would never be fully acknowledged. Many responsible parties would never be formally punished. Yet something essential had been broken: the silent continuity. Ethan left Ashford weeks later without ceremony. He took no souvenirs from the mansion. He took only the certainty that some structures remain intact only as long as no one is willing to fully understand them. And now, that story, finally, no longer belonged within the walls. Months later, the Hawthorne mansion remained closed, surrounded by discreet hoardings and bureaucratic notices. Officially, it awaited new reports. Unofficially, no one seemed to be in a hurry to reopen it. Some files were made public in fragments, others disappeared in endless commissions. Ethan Caldwell's name only appeared in technical notes, never in headlines. At night, Ashford residents still avoided looking at the hill, not out of fear of what might emerge from it, but because of what had finally been seen. And beneath those silent walls, nothing functioned as it once did. If this story has stirred unease, reflection, or discomfort in you, that's no coincidence. Narratives like this exist to question what we prefer to accept in silence, and to remind us that seemingly neutral structures can conceal profound and human choices. Share in the comments what impressed you the most: the silence of the city, Ethan's transformation, or the idea that certain truths only survive when someone decides not to erase them. If you like stories realistic, dense, with psychological mystery and endings that linger long after the final line, follow the channel and share this narrative with anyone who appreciates stories that challenge easy certainties. And say, where are you reading this story from? Their perspective is also part of what remains alive after the walls fall.